Hello everyone, welcome to the book pod. My name is Senna. Today I'm going to be doing my monthly wrap up for May. I'm really excited. I read 9 books this month. Just like last month, I tried really hard to read more, but I was struggling a little bit. So yeah, we only did 9, but that's okay. A lot of the books that I read this month were fantastic. I had a few 5-star reads, which is always super exciting. I got some good ones to talk about today. Let's jump into it. The first book that I read this month was Grey After Dark. I do not know how to pronounce this author's name, Noelle Lee. I'm not 100% sure. I could be totally butchering that, so I apologize. This book is available on Kindle Unlimited. So this book follows a young woman named Miley. She is taking a break from competing in the Olympics because of an injury. So she decides to sign up for a summer job working at this mountain lodge cabin type thing. And this is located in the wilderness in Idaho. One day she decides to go for a morning run and she is kidnapped by these 2 strange older men. They end up taking her to their off-grid cabin just miles and miles away from any civilization at all. So she's held captive there and the rest of the book is her just trying to escape. I thoroughly enjoyed this book. I had pretty high hopes for it just because I've heard a ton of people talk about it recently, and I understand why it was hyped up so much. It was really, really well written. I feel like I was on the edge of my seat pretty much the entire time. I mean, in the beginning, the author was definitely trying to do some world building and get you familiar with the characters and stuff like that. Other than the very beginning, it was just so intense, so fast-paced. I had such a hard time putting it down. It was amazing. I really, really loved it. This is a thriller that I highly, highly recommend. I don't know why I couldn't give this book a full 5 stars. I'm not sure what it was that made it not a full 5-star read for me, but I did end up giving it 4.5 out of 5 stars. Book number 2 this month was Local Woman Missing. This was one of the 4 books that my dogs chose for me to read for the month of May. If you haven't watched my video that I posted a couple of weeks ago, you should go check it out. They picked 4 total books for me to read during the month of May, and I had so much fun doing that. This was one of their picks, and this was a good one. This book follows a few different people who end up going missing. So there is a woman named Shelby. She goes out on a run at night and she never returns. And then you have a mother and daughter who also end up going missing. 11 years later, the daughter, named Delilah, randomly returns to civilization, and she's ready to tell her story about being held captive for the past decade. There's also a lot of questions surrounding the possibility that Delilah could have been kidnapped by the same person who was responsible for Shelby going missing as well. This book was honestly crazy. There were quite a few POVs, there were a few different timelines. It was incredibly engaging. I could not put this book down, and I'm really happy that it lived up to the hype that it got. The twist in this book was so incredibly unexpected. The only negative that I can say about this book is that I feel like some of the characters made some silly and stupid decisions here and there. So that was the main reason why I couldn't give this a full 5 stars, but it was so close. Again, the twist really threw me off guard. It was just so fast-paced. Another book that I couldn't put down. I needed to finish it immediately. It was just amazing. I loved how it was written. I loved the characters. Yeah, one of my favorite thrillers of the year so far. I ended up giving this book 4.5 out of 5 stars. Book number 3 this month was The Drowning Woman by Robin Harding. This book is available on Kindle Unlimited. This book follows Lee. She recently left New York after the pandemic made her lose her entire business. So she moves across the country to Seattle. Unfortunately, because the pandemic took everything from her, she is now homeless. She's living in her car just on the streets of Seattle. One day she is parked kind of in a nice neighborhood and she hears somebody like jump in the water randomly at like 5 or 6 o'clock in the morning, really early, and she decides to go see what's going on. There's a woman who appears to be trying to kill herself. She is trying to drown herself in the water, and because she has a history of swimming, she decides to jump in and try and save this woman's life. They end up forming a friendship, and after some time, she introduces herself as Hazel. Hazel tells her about some personal and family issues that are going on, and she's looking for Lee to assist her in making her disappear, making her vanish off the face of the earth. So they come together to try and start a new life for themselves, basically. This was also a really intense, fast-paced thriller. I had so many good books in a row. Again, some of these characters' decisions kind of bothered me and I think were a little unrealistic, but overall I did really enjoy this book. I flew through this one as well. It's very funny because I actually started this book, gosh, probably at least a month or two ago, and I read like 5 pages on my Kindle, and for some reason I just didn't continue reading it. But I'm really glad that I finally took the time to read it because it was fantastic. I loved how fast-paced it was. I couldn't put it down. I think the writing was incredibly engaging. I did enjoy the fact that this book took place in Seattle. I am just a sucker for books that take place in my home state of Washington. It kind of gave you a good perspective on what it could be like to be homeless as well, just all of the hoops that Lee had to jump through every single day, not having a home, having to live out of a car, safety concerns, those types of things. It was just really cool to get that type of perspective. Overall, this was another amazing thriller for the month, and I ended up giving it 4.5 out of 5 stars. Book number 4 this month was 1,000 Splendid Suns. This book starts off following a young 15-year-old girl named Miriam, and she, under some very sad circumstances, is sent to live with this older man named Rashid. They end up getting married. I think he was in his 40s. And then I think it was about like 30 years later, some other unfortunate circumstances occur to another young girl named Layla, and they take her into their household. And at first, the two women totally butt heads. They don't get along at all, but over time they really form a really beautiful friendship. I knew that this book was gonna live up to the hype, okay? I knew it was gonna be good. I honestly expected to cry a little bit more when I read this. It takes a lot for me to cry while I read, but this one definitely made me close to crying and bawling my eyes out. I definitely teared up many times. This book was really heartbreaking, extremely gut-wrenching. It was just so sad, but also the bond that these two women formed and their like lifelong friendship that they had was just so beautiful to see. I really loved the writing in this book, and I definitely loved the character development. You really saw both of these women grow throughout this book over time. Unfortunately, tragedy makes people grow up a little bit faster than they need to, especially as like a young teenager. Yeah, I really loved these characters. I definitely think this is one I will never forget. It was amazing. I ended up giving this book 5 stars. My next book for the month was For Andrea. This is also by Noelle. This book is available on Kindle Unlimited. This follows a man named James Carson. He has gotten away with murdering 3 different women, and they're all essentially haunting him in different ways. So each of these women are killed, I think, like a year apart for each one. And there are 3 different POVs of each of these 3 women, and they're in different points of time, obviously, right after they get murdered. And each of them decide to do different things. You know, one of them decides to follow him home and just kind of watch who he is, kind of just watch over him, see if he has family. And then another person is trying to get their family to hopefully get to the bottom of who killed her. At some point, the 3 of them come together, they find each other, and they band together to try and get him caught. I thought this was a very unique concept for a book. Normally, when somebody's life is taken away, you don't continue to hear their thoughts and what's going on in their head, or that they perceive anything afterwards. Yeah, I just thought this was a really intriguing concept. And this was another book this month. Again, another thriller that I had a really hard time putting down. This Angry After Dark, definitely, for sure. I definitely want to read more from this author because she just, I don't know what she puts in her books. It's just so hard to put them down. Again, one that kept me really engaged. I really love to get to know the characters. I think especially towards the part of the book where all three of them get together and they try their best to get him caught for their murders, it just got so intense. I was on the edge of my seat the whole time because it ends up not just being about them, but something else. Don't want to spoil anything, but I was seriously on the edge of my seat. It was really, really intense and I loved it. I gave this book 5 stars. The next book this month was The Green Glass Sea by Ellen Pages. This book follows a young 11-year-old girl named Dewey. She is sent to live with her father, who is a scientist in Los Alamos. During the Manhattan Project, her father is helping work on this project, and over the next few years, she has a few unfortunate things happen to her, and I'm not going to get into those things because I don't want to spoil it. She is a very unique child. She loves working on all types of mechanical projects. She builds her own alarm clock and things like that. She ends up befriending another little girl and they become friends. And yeah, it's kind of just a historical fiction type novel that takes place during the Manhattan Project. This was a book that I kind of put off for a really long time. I think I'm definitely more of a thriller type person. Those are the books that I tend to gravitate towards, and so sometimes it's hard for me to push myself to read other genres. That being said, I do really like historical fiction. I've read a lot of historical fiction books in the past that I've really enjoyed. I was honestly hoping that I'd like this book a lot more than I did. It was a little long, felt like it just dragged on a little too much. The writing didn't really keep me as hooked as I would have hoped. Sometimes I just really have to remind myself that this is not a thriller, so it's not going to be as fast-paced. But with that being said, I don't know, I definitely noticed that my mind was kind of elsewhere when I tried reading this book. I had a really hard time getting into it. I do think it was a very interesting topic though. I just kind of wished that I developed more of a connection with these characters. I think Dewey was a really cool character for sure. Otherwise though, I don't know. It just didn't keep me engaged. The writing just felt a little flat for me. That being said, there were some really sad moments, some really sweet moments. It did make me tear up once though, because Dewey kind of goes through quite a few really sad and traumatic events throughout her life. Overall, not a horrible book, but I was hoping for a little bit more. So I only ended up giving this book 3.5 out of 5 stars. Next book that I read this month was Remarkably Bright Creatures by Shelby Van Pelt. So this book follows an older woman named Tova. She is working the night shift as a cleaning lady at the Sol Bay Aquarium in Washington. She ends up forming a bond with a giant Pacific octopus at the aquarium. Tova's had a couple of losses in her family recently. Her husband passed away not too long ago, and her son passed away. And actually, she never figured out what happened to her son. He actually disappeared, so his body was never found, but it was assumed that he committed suicide. I have heard so much about this book lately, and I definitely think it deserves all the credit that it's been getting because it was fantastic. I feel like the connections that you develop with the characters are so strong, and I also really loved the concept for this book. It was very unique, and I loved how you actually had a POV from the octopus himself. His name is Marcellus, which was just really interesting. Nothing like I've ever read before. This book was very sad, but also incredibly heartwarming. Again, the connections that you develop with these characters are so strong. I do think that it took me a little bit to really get into it in the beginning, and maybe that was my fault because I don't know why I was listening to the audiobook on Spotify, and I would listen to like 20 minutes and then I would listen to it again for like 5 days, and then I would kind of forget what had just happened. So maybe that was my fault, but I just feel like in the beginning I had a really hard time like continuing to keep going, and I wasn't even sure I was going to finish it in the beginning. Once things started to unfold a little bit, you learned a little bit more about the characters and where the story was potentially going. I had a really hard time putting it down. So yeah, it was a really beautiful story. I loved how it ended and wrapped up. The only negative thing that I have to say is that There was one thing that I don't feel like was totally answered. It was to a very small degree, but I still had some questions about. I do kind of wish they were more clear about this particular aspect and how it played out. But otherwise, I absolutely loved this book and I ended up giving it 5 stars. The 8th book that I read this month was Magic Hour by Kristen Hanna. In this book, you follow Julia. She is a very well-known child psychiatrist, and unfortunately something happens with one of her patients that kind of ruins her career to a degree. So she ends up moving from California back home to a small town in Washington where her sister still lives, where she's from. Just before she got there, her sister tells her that this young 6-year-old girl emerged out of the woods, out of nowhere, and she can't speak, she can't tell anybody her name. And since Julia obviously works with a lot of kids and is a child psychiatrist, they figure that no one is better for the job than her. So they end up calling her Alice, and they try to get to the bottom of where she came from, why was she in the woods, what's her real name, who is she? I have to be honest, I had much higher hopes for this book. Kristen Hanna has become one of my favorite authors, and so I was super excited to get into this one. Unfortunately, it was a little disappointing for me. I know that this is an unpopular opinion because on Goodreads this actually has over 4 stars, so I know that most people don't agree with me. I don't know what it was about this one. I feel like I had a harder time developing connections with these characters. I feel like there were some aspects to it that were a little almost cheesy. I don't really know how to explain it because sometimes the book would be kind of from the perspective of the little girl before she could really speak, and so the way that she was talking didn't really make any sense. And I understand that she didn't know how to speak. It just, I don't know, it just felt a little cheesy to me, and so I had a hard time taking this one seriously to a degree. Again, I also just don't feel like you got that relationship with the characters that Kristen Hanna is typically really good at giving to you. I feel like in the other books that I've read by her, I love the characters and I develop really deep connections with them. I just don't really think it was the case with this one. I don't know, this was definitely an intriguing type of concept, but I don't know why it fell so flat for me. I honestly just wanted to get it done. I was not really like, oh my gosh, what's gonna happen? You know what I mean? I mean, to a degree, I wanted to know, obviously, where this little girl came from and why she was in the woods and all these things. But I don't know, I just don't feel like it pulled me in like I was hoping it would. So this one was a little bit of a letdown this month. It was probably this was, I think, the lowest rated book for the entire month. I only ended up giving it 3 stars. Now, again, don't take my word for it. This is obviously an unpopular opinion. Yeah, definitely my least favorite Kristen Hanna book so far. The last book that I read this month was A Good Girl's Guide to Murder by Holly Jackson. This book follows a girl named Pippa. Pippa is just becoming a senior, and for her senior project, she decides to embark on this crazy journey to try and figure out what happened to this girl who went missing 5 years prior. So 5 years ago, a girl named Andy Bell disappeared, and then shortly afterwards, it was thought that her boyfriend Sal had murdered her and then took his own life. For some reason, Pippa doesn't believe that this is what had happened, so for her project, she decides to try and get to the bottom of what really happened to these 2 people. Was Sal actually guilty, or was he innocent? Is Andy still alive somewhere? She just wants to know what happened. I was a little bit worried about reading this one just because it is a very well-known mystery/thriller book. So many people talk about this book, and I was worried it was going to be a huge disappointment. I have to say that it was definitely really interesting, a really unique concept. It was a book that kept me on the edge of my seat the entire time. I was honestly dying to know what would happen next. If I could say anything negative about this book, obviously this is a YA book, so it's pretty apparent it's a YA book. Also, some of the decisions on a lot of the characters, but especially Pippa herself, very questionable. The fact that she was putting herself in so many dangerous situations felt incredibly unrealistic. I tried to just roll with it for the sake of the plot. I really wanted to know what happened, so I kind of tried to brush those things aside. But yeah, a lot of it was a little unrealistic for me, so that kind of bothered me a little bit. That's definitely why I couldn't give this as high of a rating as I'd like to. But otherwise, I was hooked from the start of this book. It was really, really great at slowly unfolding each piece of evidence, and the chapters were really short. It kept me engaged the entire time. I read this in just a couple of days. I actually do really recommend this book. I don't think that it's overhyped, but just beware. It's definitely got YA written all over it. At the end of the day though, I gave this book 4 out of 5 stars. All right, and those were the 9 books that I read this month. Thank you guys so much for tuning in today. Subscribe to my channel if you want to see more from me. You can also follow me on Instagram and TikTok. Thank you guys so much for all the support, and happy reading.